everyone. My name is Alicia Elias, and I'm here with Stilly Valley Health Connections. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for this Lunch and Learn session, Vaping 101, Seeing Through the Haze. For everyone joining us live, please note that this class is set up as a Zoom webinar. This means that all participants are muted and your videos are turned off so that we can record the presentation. If you would like to leave any questions or comments, we encourage you to do so by using the chat or QA box at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for being here, and thank you to everyone who has joined us for the session so far. Now I'll pass it over to Alex with the Washington Poison Center, who will be presenting today's topic. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Hello, folks, whether you're joining live, whether you're watching the recording, so, hello to the future. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to be talking about vaping today, so specifically some trends and concerns, all from a poison center perspective. All right, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the Washington Poison Center, who we are, what we do. I'm going to talk a bit about some vaping basics, so specific things that are specific to this technology, kind of regardless of substance. We're then going to focus on nicotine and then on cannabis, specifically through that lens of vaping. For folks who are here live, please hit me with any questions as you have them. So this will look familiar to anyone who's attended any of my presentations before. I like to start with the Poison Center, specifically our mission statement. So I'll just read verbatim. Our mission is to prevent and reduce harm from poisoning through expertise, collaboration, and education. And I like to put that there because it positions us in a lot of things. It shows that we really like collaborating whenever we can. We really like maintaining expertise on all of these topics. We really love educating folks on these topics, and we remain open to education ourselves. And we also, we embrace prevention and harm reduction and treatment at the Washington Poison Center. So when talking about the Poison Center, of course, I got to talk about poison. So for us, a poison is literally anything, any product or any substance that could be harmful if it's used wrong. That could be in the wrong way, by the wrong person, or in the wrong amount. So when we think about that definition, we can think of household products and plants and even mushrooms, cleaners and disinfectants and sanitizers, bites and stings from animals, from critters, from insects, as well as medications. Medications, when used correctly, of course, can be incredibly therapeutic, but when used incorrectly, can cause all sorts of problems. Now, if you ever call the Poison Center, and I'm going to show you what that number is on the next slide, you can call and in a poison emergency, providing the person you're calling for is conscious, they're responsive, they're able to communicate with you, they're not having a seizure, we recommend you call us first before 911 because there's a good chance we can keep you at home. You can also call just with a question. Say you have a supplement and you want to make sure it's safe to take with a medication you're on, especially if it's later at night, doctors closed, pharmacies closed, we're open 24/7. So you can absolutely bounce that kind of question off of us. You can call about yourself. You can also call about someone else. Does not matter their age. Now, if you ignore everything else I say this next hour or so, please don't ignore this. This 800 number here is the National Poison Helpline, 800-222-1222. Don't forget that one. Now, we are open 24/7, 365. So you can call literally right now. You can call at 3 in the morning. You can call on major holidays, middle of the night on major holidays. Someone is going to answer that phone. You're absolutely free, so you're never going to get a bill from us. We're never going to ask insurance questions, anything like that. We're also a confidential service, so we are HIPAA compliant, and your information is protected with us. We have very well encrypted servers for all that information. We will occasionally do some care coordination with paramedics arriving on scene or with a hospital if we end up referring you in to an emergency department. And we also provide interpretation services. So if anyone who prefers any language other than English, needs that interpreter, that's no problem. We can pull that interpreter into any of our calls. So hit me up with any questions on Poison Center services, but I'm gonna just dive right into some vaping definitions. So vapes, by and large, are battery operated devices. They generally heat up some substance. Generally, that's nicotine or THC, but there are exceptions. Along with flavor, often there's flavoring of different types, as well as other chemicals, and it creates an aerosol that users inhale. You notice I've crossed out the term vapor there. I don't think there's this kind of confusion very much these days, but early on, when these products were first on the market in the United States, there was a lot of rhetoric around vapor that it releases vapor, and that implies like water vapor or steam. There's a lot more going on with this aerosol than water vapor or steam. Most of these are battery operated. There are the occasional, like kind of old school desktop vapes. We'll go into that a little bit when we start talking more about cannabis. Now, what do folks vape? Primarily, like I said, nicotine or cannabis, and there are various forms of both of those we'll go into a little bit. It is technically possible to use this technology for other substances. It can be kind of difficult though. So one barrier for a lot of these products is that it can be rather difficult to create the like liquid solution and have it suspend properly. And the goal of these products really are to heat that substance up to the point of aerosolization or vaporization, but not so that it combusts. And so that can be kind of a delicate balance depending on the substance in question. Again, there are vapes of other products. We don't have a ton of data on these, so I'm primarily focusing on nicotine and cannabis today. Now, one common thing across all vape devices, regardless of the substance, is this slide right here, ultrafine particles. So these are very well named. They are very small, teeny tiny particles that can pass through quite a few of the barriers, the natural defense mechanisms in the lungs. In general, the smaller the particle size, the deeper it can go into your lungs. There are more ultrafine particles released in vape device aerosol than there are released in smoke, specifically combustible cigarette smoke or combustible like joint smoke or pipe smoke for cannabis. Um, this is not to say that vaping is more dangerous than smoking. Not at all. Just that there is this unique consideration with vape devices. Because these chemicals, because they're so small, these ultrafine particles can travel deeper, there is a greater potential for adverse effects, and or for greater adverse effects for those particles. So just keep that in mind. Now let's talk about nicotine. I love starting with basics that first and foremost, nicotine is a natural chemical found in the tobacco plant. Now, natural does not mean safe. There are plenty of natural poisons out in the world. Cyanide and capsaicin, like these are naturally occurring things. So natural is not a oh cool, it's fine for us kind of endorsement there. Um, Now, the nicotine, it's a defense mechanism for the tobacco plant. It is a natural pesticide. So generally, when a bug takes a bite out of that plant, that bug will die. So sometimes nicotine is used in pesticide products because of that effect. Of course, it's been used for generations, like centuries now, of smoking products, cigarettes, combustible cigarettes, cigars, pipes, and so on and so forth. Smokeless tobacco products, such as chew, dry snuff, and others, and of course now for goodness, about 20 years in the United States, vaping products. Now, if you've ever heard the term vape juice or e-juice, it's generally referring to a solution that has these four main ingredients. So some form of liquid nicotine and some concentration, both propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin that helps suspend the nicotine in that solution. as well as flavoring. There's often a certain level of flavoring. A lot of regulation has changed around all of this, specifically flavoring, but it is still possible to find quite a bit of flavor options depending on the product we're talking about. Now, poison centers really like to pay attention to how something gets into the body. How something gets into the body can have a very different effect on, well, its effects in the body. Liquid nicotine getting on your skin is going to be a different reaction than it getting in your mouth versus getting in your eye. Um, nicotine generally gets into the body by inhaling it, so breathing it in, ingesting it, that's eating or drinking it, or having it absorbed through various surfaces or membranes of the body. Nicotine's kind of a funny substance in that low doses it acts more like a stimulant, and in high doses it acts more like a depressant. So in low doses we see those kind of corresponding stimulant effects: upset stomachs, folks can be dizzy, have a headache, might be really shaky, have an increase in heart rate or blood pressure, and they may have kind of clammy skin, or pale and clammy skin. In rare instances, we can see folks experience seizures with nicotine. Um, it's not super often, but it can happen. But these other symptoms listed here, these severe effects of nicotine overdose in the short term, can be quite alarming. Uh, because when we start to see those depressant effects, we get rather nervous. So if folks have an abundance of nicotine and they're experiencing lethargy or weakness or confusion, they may have a lowering of their heart rate or blood pressure. They may ultimately actually start having trouble breathing. Now, it is rare, but it is possible to ingest or take in a fatal amount of nicotine. And so it's kind of similar to how opioids can interrupt that pathway between your brain and your lungs to keep you breathing. Doesn't happen much, but it is possible. I should have emphasized before speaking on this slide, when folks contact the poison center, they're generally calling because something has gone wrong in the short term. So, an example would be my child got into the chewing tobacco. They're typically not calling us looking for assistance with like tobacco use disorder, for example. So they're not calling us asking for that approach to treatment. They're calling more for, hey, this thing happened in the short term. There's a potential overdose situation on this product. So, nicotine and the brain. So, especially when it's inhaled, nicotine can reach the brain and the bloodstream very, very, very quickly, within seconds or minutes. Nicotine releases a whole lot of what we call dopamine. That is our brain's feel-good button. And so repeated use of any nicotine product starts to train the brain to repeat that action because it's releasing that feel good button. Um, and I think it's always important when we're talking about substance use, when we're talking about physical dependence or addiction or use disorder or anything like that, that we also acknowledge like there are a lot of reasons why someone might seek out nicotine and continue use of nicotine outside of that addiction element. So pleasure, there is, because there is that dopamine being released, there is that short-term euphoria that some folks can experience with nicotine products. A lot of folks report a decrease in stress and anxiety, especially in the short term. And I think that's really key when we're framing substance use when talking about short term versus long term. Keep in mind, this is a stimulant in low doses, and a lot of folks can have a decrease in stress if they have increased focus. A lot of folks report mood control. A lot of folks report improved concentration. And some folks seek out or continue use because nicotine can suppress the appetite a bit. Now, the more we use nicotine, much like most any substance, the more we start to crave. nicotine. Nicotine is kind of interesting in that we break it down somewhat quickly. Our bodies break it down somewhat quickly. Whoops, I jumped ahead there. There we are. Um, and when we're looking at, decades of tobacco research, we see that the more someone uses nicotine, the more brain receptors grow in response to that nicotine use, and this kind of doubles down on those cravings. Whenever your brain is building more receptors for something, it means it's expecting more of that something. And then, anything that affects learning, stress, and self-control, when we use it again and again and again and again, we start to change our patterns around learning, stress, and self-control. I also think it's worth acknowledging withdrawal symptoms. Anytime someone forms that physical dependence on something and forms that tolerance to something where they need to use more and more and more of it to get the desired effect, and they stop intake of that substance, they stop using that substance, they're likely going to experience withdrawal symptoms. And withdrawal with nicotine is incredibly intense. Folks can have really intense difficulty concentrating, can deal with irritability, depression or depressed mood, restlessness, anxiety, insomnia. Counterintuitively, this is a substance that is a stimulant in low doses, but when you take it away, a lot of folks report insomnia, which can feel counterintuitive. Now, I'm not an expert on tobacco use disorder treatment, but I do know of some resources, and one of the best starting points for seeking treatment with quitting tobacco and nicotine use is the quit line, the Washington quit line. So I recommend checking that out for folks who are interested. All right, now a bit on youth-specific concerns with nicotine. Basically, youth-specific concerns are the same as adult concerns, but more. Really, because the hallmark of adolescence is brain development. And when you add this external substance into the mix during adolescence, during this period of brain development, the brain forms around that. The brain, all these different pathways it forms will kind of keep that expectation of nicotine in mind. So it can increase the intensity and likelihood of dependence, and it can make it more difficult to quit the use of that substance. It can also have more long-term effects on attention, learning, mood, and impulse control. All right, so this slide here, this is the extent of chemistry that I'm going to throw at you. This is a pH scale for those unfamiliar with this multicolored image here. So pH scale shows, how acidic or basic something is. The human body loves to live right in the middle there, right at 7. And generally, the further away from 7 you go in either direction, toward 0 or toward 14, the harsher that substance is to the human body. So the very first vape devices used a form of nicotine we call freebase nicotine. This is the same kind of nicotine we see in combustible cigarettes, pipe tobacco, chewing tobacco, and we've seen for many, 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 many years. It has a pH of around 8 to 8.5. So even if you somehow removed heat from the equation, if someone is inhaling tobacco smoke in any form that has freebase nicotine in it, there's going to be a bit of a harshness, a harsh sensation, because that is slightly basic. The pH is slightly basic there. Now, for folks who are familiar with Juul devices, they were the first to figure out something called salt-based nicotine. Salt-based nicotine is a solution of nicotine that has salt acids mixed into that solution, so it brings the pH down a little bit closer to that of the human body. Not to say that it is a healthier nicotine, but the experience of using it can be less intense, less harsh. It also has an interesting quality of it doesn't need to be quite as hot to aerosolize or vaporize. So free-base nicotine hits that aerosolization point around 420 degrees Fahrenheit. Salt-based nicotine reaches that point at a bit under 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Why this matters, like why am I showing this to you? Because this is the pathway for how we got smaller vape devices over time. In addition to not needing as much heat, not needing as much power to aerosolize salt-based nicotine, because you didn't need to get it as hot, um, that means you could have a smaller battery, you could have a smaller heating element. Having that less harsh sensation meant that producers could have a higher concentration of liquid nicotine, salt-based nicotine specifically, in that liquid nicotine solution. That meant you needed less total liquid in that chamber, in that reservoir. All of this cascades down to a smaller, more discrete device. So this is just a basic little evolution of vape devices over the years. So some of the very first we saw in the US in this would have been mid to late 2000s, I think 2007, were this first category, minis or cigalikes. And these really are the truest quote unquote e-cigarettes. You don't hear that term quite as much. Vape or vape device it seems to be the go-to umbrella term now. But those true e-cigarettes, those minis or cigalikes, those were meant to simulate smoking, and so they're fully disposable. So you use them until either the liquid nicotine or the power runs out, and you replace them after. A lot of them have a little like LED ember that glows to again simulate that experience of smoking. Mid-size vape pens entered the market shortly after. Their big appeal is that they're refillable and rechargeable. Um, so a lot of marketing around like cost savings with that. Box mods, these images aren't to scale either, but box mods are very big, they can be very big and very powerful vaping devices. Because they're more powerful, they can release some pretty thick plumes of that vape aerosol. And anecdotally, allegedly, because their plumes can be so thick, I've heard reports of folks saying that it feels more like smoking when using these more powerful box mods. And all of those styles of device, some of which are still on the market, use freebase nicotine. Now, like I said, Juul was the first to figure out salt-based nicotine. They were certainly not the last, though. There are these refillable and rechargeable pod vapes, as well as disposable salt-based vaping devices. Now, these disposable salt-based devices are technically not allowed to be on the market anymore. They're not in the FDA approved list of vape devices, yet they are still very accessible within the United States. Often, folks can find them online or in gas stations or corner stores. One of their big concerns is one of the big concerns about them, I should say, excuse me, is that they are often very, very heavily flavored. And as we know, flavoring can be very appealing, really to anyone, but especially to youth. Now, other concerns with the aerosol. Outside of nicotine, we can see other carcinogens at play. We can see heavy metals used in the construction of the devices themselves. And as these devices heat up and cool down, some of those heavy metals can leach into that aerosol. We can, of course, see flavoring in certain products. Now, a lot of the flavoring here, is approved for ingestion but not inhalation. Our stomach and lungs are very different organs, so what one can handle, the other may not necessarily be able to. Diacetyl is a really common example of a concerning flavoring. When inhaled, diacetyl can cause these lesions in the airway, and it is commonly used in artificial butter flavor and some artificial strawberry flavoring as well. Propylene glycol is another example of a substance that is approved in certain amounts for ingestion, but not inhalation. And when it heats up too much, it can start to release amounts of formaldehyde. We don't really need formaldehyde in our bodies. We can see trace amounts of silicone, and that can cause silicosis in the lungs. We can see free radicals and other carcinogen pesticides, as well as nitrosamines. Now, nitrosamines, it's a big category of carcinogens that we see in a lot of combustible cigarettes, but we do see some of them in vape devices as well. Now, I'm going to share some poison center data here. Pause for just a second to take a sip of water. Couple things to keep in mind with poison center data is there's really no mandate to contact us. So the data I share is going to be an underrepresentation of Washington cases or exposures to a given substance in a given age group for a given reason. Um, our data can change for a lot of reasons. So if we see an increase in something, it could mean that there is an increase in awareness of poison centers. It mean, maybe more people know that they can call us about a certain product or a certain exposure. Could be that there's a change in access to a substance or awareness of a substance. We didn't get calls for vape devices in the 90s because they didn't exist then. So we have a change in access to a substance or technology in this case. We can see changes in our data in response to large-scale stressors, large-scale traumas. So we saw some interesting trends in our data during early parts of 2020 and 2021 as we were all grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. We got a lot of increases in calls around cleaning products and sanitizers. And then we also update our database coding whenever possible. There are new products on the market all the time, and as we become aware of them and start noticing trends, we do our best to update our coding. And then, like I said earlier, our folks generally call us when something has gone wrong in the short term, not long term. So our data reflects that. You're going to see a lot of acute exposures, not chronic exposures here. All of that to say, here is some comparison data. This is all Washington State, all calls to the Washington Poison Center across 2024 and 2025. I went with some, Western Washington sports team colors here. Um, so nicotine, and this is true kind of regardless of the year, almost all of our nicotine exposure cases are for little kids, kids under the age of 6. What this tells me is that most of these cases are due to a lack of safe storage of a nicotine product in the home. Um, does not mean that we don't get calls for these other age groups. We clearly do, but nowhere near the number that we do for these little kid exposures. And I know a lot of anyone watching this who may work in schools, I know there is a lot of concern about teen use of vape devices. I don't want this data to make you think, oh, well, no teen is using a vape device ever. Not at all. It just means we're very rarely getting called in those cases. Now, when we look at nicotine cases by reason, again, comparing 2024 to 2025 here. Um, because most of these calls are for little kids, most of those are going to be coded as this code unintentional general. That means it was an accident that the individual who was exposed, couldn't cognitively decide one way or the other. What I mean by that is we don't have 3-year-olds going, I really want a nicotine buzz right now, and pop a cigarette butt in their mouth. A 3-year-old pops a cigarette butt in their mouth because they're curious. Um, we also, we track some other reasons for nicotine for all of our calls. Intentional abuse, and I want to acknowledge that the term substance abuse or drug abuse is absolutely a stigmatizing term. I have it on screen here, and I'm using this phrase now because that is still tied to poison center coding. If you're ever looking at poison center data and you see that intentional abuse category, that means that patient was seeking some psychoactive effect, attempting to get high, to get drunk, whatever it might be. Some of our nicotine cases are that category, but very few. And then we do have this kind of broad amorphous category of misuse. So that's simply using a product incorrectly. That could mean I thought I was supposed to drink the liquid nicotine, not vape the liquid nicotine. Things like that. And then when we look at our calls around nicotine products, like type of nicotine product, I have just a very simple breakdown of vaping product versus tobacco product. Green is 2025 here, blue is 2024. What's kind of interesting to me about this is this sort of shift uh, between 2025 and 2024, but in previous years as well. Historically, we used to get far more calls around tobacco products than vaping products. Um, a lot of exposures to kids eating cigarette butts, like I said earlier, or an adult using a can of soda as an ashtray, and kid takes a sip. We saw a shift in the like 2021, 2022, 2023, around that era of more calls specific to vaping products. And that's actually shifted again. And the big reason why is the introduction of nicotine pouches. And the way our coding works, we consider nicotine pouches a tobacco product under that broad category. And we saw a little over 100 nicotine pouch exposures in 2024 and over 150 in 2025. For those who don't know what nicotine pouches are, they're kind of akin to chewing tobacco, except uh, you're not meant to spit the way you do with chewing tobacco. They tuck under the gum or lip, and nicotine enters the bloodstream through. Oh, whoops! I did not finish that sentence there. Apologies, folks. Enters the bloodstream through the membranes in the mouth there. Um, a number of these pouches are FDA approved. The argument for that approval is that they are likely less harmful than a lot of other nicotine products because there isn't as many chemicals, isn't as many carcinogens in these products compared to a lot of others. And I do have to add that reminder that safer does not mean safe. This does not mean they are free of harm, just that they may not have as many possible harms as some of the other nicotine products. There are a number of flavored products that are allowed to be on the market, and flavoring is often a concern for initiating youth use. All right, checking the time. We seem to be about halfway through right now. I'm going to pivot toward cannabis and talk about cannabis vaping. Please hit me up with questions if you have them, as you have them, and I'm happy to jump back at any point. All right, so talking about cannabis, this term cannabis sativa refers to the plant itself. Now, this one plant has just a ton of variety. I'm not going to list every possible strain because that would take days. Um, but I do want to draw attention to a couple key terms here. So Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, this is THC. If you see THC just on its own without any modifiers, you can generally assume it's Delta 9 THC. This is the main regulated and the main intoxicating component of the cannabis plant. It is still technically a Schedule 1 substance, which means it is fully federally illegal. We are in the process, I should not we as in me, but the United States is in the process of reclassifying cannabis or anything with more than 0.3% THC as a Schedule 3 drug. This does not mean that cannabis is suddenly going to be legalized. It does mean it will be a bit easier to research some of the potential health effects of cannabis products than it currently is. It's also worth acknowledging this term hemp. This refers to any form of cannabis, any form of plant material from the cannabis plant with less than 0.3% THC. This is a federally legal substance. It is no longer scheduled. Now, like I said about nicotine, THC can get into the body in similar ways through inhalation, ingestion, and absorption. Major effects of THC generally last 4 to 6 hours after it hits the bloodstream. This is not a comprehensive list of all THC symptoms. There are a number of them. These are just some of what we see at the Poison Center and elsewhere. A lot of folks can be really sleepy, really lethargic. We may get reports of mood change, mild or severe. That could be euphoria. THC does release dopamine. That could be relaxation. That could mean anxiety. That could mean paranoia. We absolutely see impaired attention, impaired memory, impaired time estimation. We can see some folks experience really intense paranoia or anxiety or panic attacks. Other folks, we're getting more and more reports over the years, especially with high dose THC, may experience THC-induced hallucinations or psychosis. We can absolutely see decreased motor coordination, changes in heart rate, sometimes issues in the gut, and dilated pupils as well. Now, pharmacokinetics, this is a really fancy way of saying, of describing how a drug moves through the body. THC is what we call lipophilic, so it really likes fatty tissue. So it hangs out in adipose tissue, in the liver, the lung, and the spleen, or I should say markers of it can hang out in that fatty tissue. Like I said earlier, major effects last 4 to 6 hours after it hits the bloodstream. THC is largely is metabolized in the liver, so a lot of it's going to come out just in our waste. And then THC, as well as CBD, another cannabinoid here, um, can persist in the body for individuals who use very regularly, very heavily, for up to 3 months after they stop use. That does not mean that someone is going to be like intoxicated during that whole 3 month period, but it does mean that they're likely going to test positive on a drug test during that period as their body kind of filters those markers out. Now, when we're looking at the brain and body with cannabis use, cannabis acts on what we call the endocannabinoid system. That system that is built in you, regardless of if you ever use cannabis or not, and it interfaces with all these other systems in the body. It can indirectly influence stress and anxiety, learning, memory, reward, and a lot of other things. And I think it is worth acknowledging there's a lot of rhetoric around therapeutic effects or benefits of cannabis use. And, some of that research suggests that THC can have anti-inflammatory properties, that THC can potentially help with short-term sleep disturbance, emphasis on short-term there. We can see some anti-nausea and anti-vomiting properties especially with lower amounts of THC. There's some potential for the application of THC in chronic pain management, and there is at least one medication on the market that's derived from CBD. This is called Epidiolex that can help reduce number and intensity of seizures for some folks with different types of epilepsy. Now, adolescence, like I said earlier, the hallmark of adolescence is that brain development. During periods of brain development, we see that the endocannabinoid system is very, very active. It's helping kind of smooth things over with various systems in the body. Um, and the brain, I should say. And like I said with nicotine, this is really true of most any substance. The earlier someone uses cannabis in life, the greater their risk of developing that dependence. Talking a little bit about cannabis dependence, we can definitely see folks build a tolerance pretty rapidly. So if folks are seeking cannabis out for like a medical use, for example, they may experience that they need to have more and more and more THC to get the effect they're looking for. And like I said earlier, anytime we see tolerance form, we can see withdrawal form as well when someone stops using that substance. And we definitely see that with cannabis. Because of that whole adipose fatty tissue thing I talked about earlier, there can be this kind of odd phenomenon where folks who use very heavily may not actually experience withdrawal for a while. It may take a couple weeks for those withdrawal signs to kick in. Some withdrawal symptoms we come across are sleep disruption, tremors. Folks can be really anxious or irritable or even angry. They may experience bouts of depression, difficulty concentrating, and things like that. A little bit on schizophrenia and psychosis. I want to note a difference between diagnosed chronic long-term schizophrenia or a psychotic disorder. That is one thing, and that is different from an acute bout of psychosis or a single hallucination or bout of delusion. Now, there's newer research over the past few years drawing on these links between cannabis use and both the increased risk of having an acute short-term bout of psychosis as well as increased use of being di or increased risk of being diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. Some of the risk factors are higher doses of THC. A lot of these studies define high dose cannabis as any product with at least 10% THC. Almost all legally sold dry flower in the state of Washington is over 15% THC. And that was a sample done in 2020. I believe the average THC level is around 20% for the plant material, the dry flower. Frequent use of cannabis is also a risk factor, and then starting at a young age is also a risk factor. And that reminder, the human brain keeps developing through age 25. All right, now bringing it back to vaping, these are the two main forms of cannabis that folks are likely going to use in a vape device, that dried flower, like I was just referencing, as well as concentrated products. Of course, concentrated products have higher concentrations of THC. Now, when we look at this slide here, this is meant to mirror the earlier slide on vape devices for tobacco products or nicotine products, I should say. Um, the very first category is a bit different, though. These tabletop or desktop vapes, these were really the first um, uh, occurrence that I'm aware of, at least, of this technology being used for a substance. Except these were never portable. These are pretty big, pretty big devices that are meant to be on a table or a desk. But we of course see dry flower vapes. We see those disposable vape products like e-cigarettes, but e-joints in this case. We can see solid concentrate vapes. Some folks will call these dab pens. We'll talk about dabbing in just a moment. We also see liquid oil vape devices as well as these multi-product vape devices. For folks who've heard this term dabbing, I've heard some folks say that it's just a regional term for the same thing, vaping versus dabbing. Other folks, and I tend to be in this camp, frame vaping versus dabbing around the type of heat that's used in the device. So vaping uses a convective heat or an indirect heat. It heats up the air. The air heats up the product. That is arguably a cleaner heat in that there are fewer carcinogens being released all at once. Um, it often takes more energy to heat up the air than the substance. We see this for both nicotine and cannabis products. Dabbing, on the other hand, uses conductive heat. So it heats up a surface and you put the substance on that surface directly. That does release a whole lot more all at once, including those carcinogens. We tend to just see this for cannabis products. A little bit more on dabbing. It often uses a high heat to release a lot of THC all at once. It is using a concentrated THC product to begin with. There is a pretty rapid onset of effects here, so it can kick in for the user very, very quickly. There is also the concern just of burning because you're generally using something like a blowtorch or an electrical hookup to sort of superheat the material there. So of course there's the potential for burns and there's the potential for taking on a higher dose than intended. All right, so let's look at a little bit of poison center data here. Um, let's see. We have In 2024, we had a total of 608 cases. We actually saw a reduction in THC cases reported to the Poison Center from 2024 to 2025. We had went down to about 591 cases in 2025. That's the first reduction from year to year I've seen being at the Poison Center since legalization. Now, looking at these different age groups, of course, we see a big concentration in little kids, but we see more representation than nicotine with THC in every age category here. When we look at exposure by type, so this is type of cannabis product, we aren't always able to break it down when it is a vape device, but we can see the versions of THC or cannabis that would be used in potentially used in a vape device. So that would fall under the concentrate or the flower cases there. Edibles remain our most common cannabis exposure call. And that's any form of that's a form of cannabis that is in food and drink products. And then we have our other category, which includes pills and topicals and other formulations. We do track CBD and non-THC cannabinoid calls, but we don't get very many of those relative to THC. This not for kids label here, I think this is probably one of the main reasons why we get so many calls for edibles relative to other THC products or cannabis products, and it's because this legally has to be on those products. And you may recognize that is the poison helpline there. Looking at calls by reason, pardon me, we, of course, see a lot of those accident calls, those unintentional general. We do see a number of those intentional abuse calls or intoxication seeking calls. And then we have a number of misuse cases as well as therapeutic error. Therapeutic error just means medication error. And cannabis is rather tricky compared to a lot of other substances because in Washington State, we do have a medical cannabis legal infrastructure. So there are certain cases where we will code as a medication error involving cannabis. Now we're nearly at the end here, and I'm gonna throw this slide in. I occasionally just get this question of like, is vaping safer than smoking? Um, Kinda, sorta, depending on how you're framing it. There is a strong argument, a pretty good argument for vaping being safer than smoking. There are FDA approved vapes on the market. When I last looked, there were 34 total vape products allowed. This is all nicotine. This is not cannabis. There are some caveats and considerations with this claim, though, that vaping is safer than smoking. First, vaping can be safer than smoking if the person using these products completely switches from smoking to vaping, because that person is likely getting fewer total carcinogens in their body that way. The tricky thing here is that that person has to completely switch. If they're using both, they're very likely just getting all the carcinogens of smoking plus the extra nicotine of vaping. Some of the more common products we see and that we're concerned about, especially those disposable salt-based products, are not FDA approved, and they're still in the marketplace anyway. And there, regardless of the substance, there is that concern with ultrafine particles. And adolescents are far more likely to vape than they are to smoke. So there are these other concerns. If we think about a single individual switching completely from vaping to smoking, that could be safer. When we step back and start looking at these larger public health implications of vaping, the answer is not as cut and dry. Oh, and I am seeing, let's see. Oh, getting a question on the slides. I know that this is being recorded, so that recording will be posted for anyone to access at a later point. Last couple slides here. Another chance for you to add the Poison Helpline into your phone. That's 800-222-1222. And if folks have any questions about the materials or would like to schedule another training, this is my direct email address, asirotzki@wapc.org. I will say if you have a poison emergency, please don't email me that. Please call the poison helpline. All right, folks. Well, I'm happy to hang out for a few minutes in case there are any questions, but that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you to everyone who has joined us for this class. As you leave today's webinar, a quick 6-question survey will appear on your screen. We would love it if you could take a minute to let us know what you thought of this class and to share any feedback or suggestions for future classes. Our next Lunch and Learn with Alex will be Cannabis 101 Evidence and Considerations, and that will be hosted on Wednesday, June 10th, and we hope to see you there. If there's no questions, I think we are all good to go. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you in the future.
Thanks, folks. Take care.